So one of the things that you get when you spend enough time in the roof repair game, as opposed to the general roofing game, is nuance. Now, nuance as a word, nuance, has a nuance within itself, because NU, you would think that nuance is pronounced nuance, but generally it's nuance, as in N-E-W, nuance. Anyway, in the roof repair game, a lot of things aren't quite as obvious. And when things are not obvious, you look at the things that are around the edges. In other words, the nuances. So as an example, we'll take a box gutter, a leak at a box gutter. So we've got this factory here in Sydney that's got a leak in a box gutter. So the tenants rung up and said, listen, we've got a leak. It only happens every now and then when you get heavy rain and when there's prolonged rain. And if we don't get that, we don't generally get a leak. So can you help us track the leak down and get it fixed? Now, there are many ways that a box gutter can leak. The obvious is an overflow. You got a block in the nozzle, whether there's an overflow in the box gutter or not, and if the water doesn't overflow outside, it overflows inside, you get a huge leak. A large amount of water comes in, and that's quite obvious. So if an owner says they had a deluge, then it's an overflow issue. Now, if a leak suddenly appears after a long service, then it's quite likely to be a rusted box gutter that's developed a hole and that's starting to leak. So these things are quite obvious, and they're the things that we can see when we get up on a roof, look at a box gutter, and we go, there we are, that's the reason that we've got a leak. But a lot of things aren't quite as obvious. So in this case, we've got a box gutter, quite new, and when you look at it, it's got what looks like good silicone all the way around, and nice thick silicone. And what we always look for is, if it's recently rained and there's water in a box gutter or in a sump, we can generally say that the joints aren't leaking. Anyway, the joints that are below the waterline aren't leaking, because if the joints below the waterline was leaking, then you won't have any water anymore, because it would have drained out and you could actually see a leak underneath. So when you go and have a look, in this instance, look at this sump, it's got a thin layer of water underneath, and you go, it's not leaking at the moment, you could safely say that the joints at the base of the sump aren't leaking. So where else can this leak come from? And this is when we have to look at the little things, the nuances, the little things that can make a huge difference, because the nuances in our lives are the things that really matter. Not the big things, the little things, the nuances. So what we have to do is go back to first principles and look at how we actually install a sump in a box gutter. So to fully understand box gutters and sumps, we kind of have to go back to first principles, and we've got to look at how sumps are installed in box gutters. So what we have here is a typical sump. Now, the sump comes pre-made, and they're the joints, and you can see it's sealed, pop riveted. You look at the back, and hopefully that seal has been, that lap has been fully sealed underneath, although I can't see any silicone in there. There's not a lot of silicone in there. So it looks like maybe they've just done an overseal. You can look at, if we peel that back, see, even the guys in the factory have done the wrong thing. It looks, so there is the plastic, and they've actually sealed to the plastic, which is not all that good. So when you peel the plastic off to put the sump in, you'll see that there's sealant in there, but it's probably no sealant under the lap. So what you have here is, back to first principles,
that little point right there in the corner, that potentially is going to leak from a factory made sump. So what the installer has to do is to make sure that when this sump goes in, there's more sealant put over that, and that also means that the pop rivets are also covered with sealant and this joint doesn't actually leak. So on a typical sump, you'll have, you got no joint there, no joint there, and you haven't got a joint there, nor have you got a joint here. If you flip it upside down, you'll see that no joints there and all the joints in the corner. So that's what you've got to watch out for. That little, see that little thing in there? That is a hole, and it has to be sealed. That's a hole. So we'll go back to first principles, look at how a box cutter is put together. All right, so we're going to look at how you actually install a sump. You've got a box cutter, you measure the size of the sump, cut the sump out, and peel the plastic back. And you've got your sump. Very important, what you do is you either flip the sump around, so you put silicone around here, there. So on the four edges you put silicone. So careful not to get it over your hands, and you go. So the sump's been installed and you'll have silicone oozing out of there, and chances are is that you'll get silicone into the corners. But every now and then you would miss, and that little corner will be lacking a bit of silicone, and this is where the leak will start, right at this very corner. Worse still, a lot of roofers don't seal underneath. They rely on the fact that they can overseal, so they would cut a hole, not put any sealant on because it's just going to make the hands dirty. They will plonk the sump in, and then they would pop rivet and then do an overseal. And that is going to cause a lot of problems, because if the overseal doesn't go into the corner, then that's where it's going to leak. At least if you silicone underneath and there's a lot of silicone, when you drop the sump down and the silicone squeezes out, potentially a lot of silicone will go into that corner, and then when you smooth it out, you will actually seal that corner. So small details, but it can make a huge difference.
So now that we understand how a sump is actually installed in the box cutter, we know what to look for. So immediately what we are looking at are the four corners of the sump. And when we did a bit of digging around, we could see that one of the corners, the sealant we could peel away slightly. And when we look closer, we could actually peel the sealant back and see a little hole right in the corner. So this is something that most roofers will not be able to find. It's something that is not quite so obvious. So typically a roofer will go up and have a look and go, I don't know where it's leaking. I'm not quite sure what to do. But once you learn more about box cutters and sumps and how they are actually installed, then you know the little areas that need the extra attention, the nuances. Little things can make huge differences. So what you'll find in our lives is that the high performers live around the nuances. And you can take the Olympic Games that we've just seen in Paris as an example. The top level athletes are pretty much at the same level. And the difference between gold medal and no medal at all is that tiny little bit of difference. It's the nuance that that athlete can find at that very moment when the competition's on that will enable them to get the medal. The tiny nuances that make all the difference.